The question I have for you is, have you thought about where your team goes next? Have you thought about where your team has come from and what practices you have implemented in your position? Have you ever heard that you're going to be automated out of a job? Okay, I see a few heads nodding no. How many people say yes, that's a goal, or you've heard that that's going to happen? Okay, I've got another question for you then. Do you think that change will ever stop? How many people think that change will stop? Huh, okay, all right, we've got an interesting perspective here. Well, I guess that's one perspective. I read a nice article based on a book called Beyond Blame that was written by Dave Zweibeck. And in Beyond Blame, he talks about blameless postmortems, as you might imagine, and raises the interesting point that ultimately there is one root cause for everything. And that one root cause is the fact that things change. And so we may as well stop doing root cause analysis, because root cause is not what we're after. What we're after is understanding the contributing causes. So looking at how things change and looking at how teams acquire skill is similar to the way that individuals acquire skill. So there's a three-stage model that's popular amongst some Oriental martial arts. These particular terms come from Aikido. And in the Shu phase, you have to learn the mechanical basis or the forms of your art. Then in Ha, you learn to innovate upon those basic forms. And at Re, you begin to transcend the forms and develop your own patterns. Now, Western people like to have more than 3 categories. And so Dreyfus, which is the category that I talked about in the abstract, actually has 5 categories. But to me, the first 3 all lump into the Shu phase. So you have novice, beginner, and competent. I've changed some of the terms slightly if you go look up the Dreyfus model. And essentially, the novice follows the rules. You've got a brand new employee. They come, they follow the onboarding handbook, they do the things that they're taught to do without understanding the wider context. A beginner has some situational perception, understanding the directly impinging pieces, whereas the competent begins to have active decision-making and begins to be able to choose a course of action instead of just taking what's been given to them. When you move into proficiency, you then begin to assign importance to different components of what you're seeing in your environment. And ultimately, as you move to mastery, then you begin to have a tacit understanding, an intuitive understanding of a much larger picture. Now, there are some folks who have added yet more states. Innocent means you have maybe heard that there is such a thing as SRE, but you don't know what it is. Or perhaps you read or perhaps your boss read an article in a magazine on an airplane and now thinks that the latest thing they must do is SRE because he read it's an up-and-coming thing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the expert, and they're the folks who write the SRE book. So let's take, on an organizational basis, and look at some signposts of practice. These are areas that pretty much everybody at SRE, in the SRE profession, encounters or does to some degree, better, worse. Remember, the boundaries are fuzzy, and this is not intended to make anyone feel bad, but it gives you an idea of, hey, I'm just sort of learning the ropes here. And so the things that the Google folks do won't necessarily apply to me immediately. Or perhaps I've been doing this and my team is really quite good at it, and so I can take the next step into more exotic things. One of the speakers this morning talked about when he was asked if his deployment system could be open sourced from Google. He said, well, I could probably give you the code, and you could probably compile the Go binary, but you wouldn't be able to run it because you don't have the rest of the Google stack. And even if you had some of the Google stack, you wouldn't have all of the other infrastructure that keeps everything working at Google. So bear in mind that these practices rely upon values, they rely upon a company culture, and it's a circular positive or negative circle. So like our speaker yesterday, Narayan, started off by saying, the values underscore the practices. So the areas I'm going to talk about are incident response and prevention, postmortems, SL star eyes, and monitoring. And we'll see what these might look like at different phases of expertise. Let's start off with incident response, and I'm going to take some of this language and some of this concept from a presentation I saw by J. Paul Reed. The novice team is alarmed by incidents. They mostly get external notifications, customers calling them, say, that tells them there's an incident. Whereas a beginner team might fear incidents. They're afraid they're going to happen, and in order to respond well to incidents, they have to have particular people engaged. So it would be a really tribal knowledge. This group of people needs to be contacted or woken up in order to deal with this kind of a problem. Competent organizations or teams become aware that incidents are normal. They start to have more standardized processes, and so therefore individual people become less critical to getting problems taken care of. Proficient teams have gotten to the point where they accept that incidents are normal, and ultimately teams that have mastered the issues of incident response to some degree understand that incidents are a learning experience, and they have a strong feedback framework that then takes the learnings they get from these incidents and improves their systems. Let's look at incident prevention. So the novice teams or organizations have primarily manually identified static causes for any sort of an incident. It's just their paradigm for looking at the world. As you progress to a beginner stage, you get better documentation. You recognize that there's both static causes and action-based causes. And as you move to what I'm calling the competent phase, you look at how the team in general reacts to incidents, and you look to improve the team response. Moving on to proficient, I've just sort of arbitrarily lumped this in here, is that you're in an early phase of understanding that injecting incidents into your complex system helps you to improve both an understanding of how it behaves as well as its reliability. But only a little, please, not too much. Let's make sure that everybody knows it's going to happen at the right time. Whereas when you move to the master phase, it's bring it on. Random chaos is the thing they thrive on. Let's talk about postmortems and see what it might look like across the spectrum of learning. Sadly, the novice is blameful. They only use this when the site blows up or the UPS burns down, if you were in the Tales from Production last night. And they're looking for a scapegoat. Beginner teams start to do it a little bit more regularly, but they're still looking for a cause, and they're focusing on what mistakes were made. Competent teams, again, this is becoming a more regular part of their daily execution. They're looking past blaming, or starting to look past blaming. And when you move into proficiency, we're getting into the category where people say, hey, this is a blameless postmortem. They're looking at the problem, not the people. They're using their processes consistently, and they're feeding back the learnings into the organization so that they don't have to repeat the same problems. At the master level, you take your postmortems and you raise it up a level. You're looking at larger themes, you're learning from this particular incident, and you apply it systemically to fix other things before they break. Let's look at signposts of SLAs, I's, O's. I probably should have thrown in the other vowels just for fun. So let's say the novice. The novice team is only going to do an SLA if they're forced to contractually, probably. They have only heard of SLAs because they were imposed upon them, or perhaps they imposed them on their vendors. They probably calculate these manually, by the way, on a quarterly basis when they're absolutely required to report on them. The beginner team actually realizes that maybe there's something more to it than just what we have to provide our customers, but they perhaps only measure the easy things. Competent teams move on and are measuring the most important things for their systems. They're measuring internal SLOs, and they're not just concerned about contractual performance. Moving on to proficiency, you have a well-developed set of measures with historical records, baselines, and the master team has meaningful measures throughout the system. I kind of ran out of a description on that one, but if anyone has a suggestion, I'm open to suggestions. How does monitoring look across the spectrum? The novice has pretty much not much. The beginner perhaps measures things that they can get out of the box. They bought a monitoring system from some vendor that gives them DevOps in a box, or they put Nagios in, or they put something in that and they take whatever it provides them without necessarily being selective about it. And it's probably spotty. They do it for the most important systems, not necessarily consistently across their entire platform. The competent team has more consistent monitoring, perhaps over most all of their systems, and they're collecting enough information that they can start to understand statistical anomalies. Even if they're detected manually, at least they've got the data, and they can start doing some automated processing. Proficient teams, I've gone to the level of saying that they have thorough instrumentation across all service components, and that they're able to correlate internal and external measures. And the master team, because observability is the byword of the day, I'm just going to say that they have data observable upon demand, and that they can do automated correlation and anomaly detection. Now, I've taken 5 areas of practice. We probably all realize that there's a lot more to SRE than just these 5 areas. At least I hope you do. So there's other areas that could be broken down and characterized across this sort of spectrum as well. Perhaps we could talk about error budgets. Do you have them? Do you use them? How about your change management practices? Demand forecasting and the cost for delivering your service. How about your provisioning processes, your deployment tool chains, such as we've had talks about earlier in the conference? How about the efficiency with which you utilize the services, power, water, at the most basic level in your data centers? And an area that I'm pushing our devs to work on is, do your services plan for retirement? When you're designing a service, have you thought about what it will take to turn it down when it's replaced by the next great thing? Or are you building your services to last forever, and then everyone gets surprised and hurt when they have to be torn out and pulled out by the roots to replace them with something that's better in 3, 5 years, maybe 6 months, as the case may be? More areas that could be put into this. When you get new services, how long does it take you from the time that they first enter your production space until you would consider them stably supported? Mean time to sleep, hat tip to Etsy from a couple of conferences a few years ago. How often are your engineers woken up out of band or out of normal waking hours? At LinkedIn, we've developed a tool called Insomnia, because we like to name everything with an in, which tracks something like this, is how many out-of-hours calls are levied against a team. How about what fraction of your SRE's time is spent on toil? And is that trending up or down? If you want to assess your organization's level of practice, coming to conferences like this is a great way to do it because you can talk to people across the gamut. You talk to people who are working for small startups, who are trying to explore how to implement SRE. You also talk to people at massive, historically legacy companies that are also trying to figure out how to implement SRE and where they can make the most bang for the buck. It's all a learning exercise, and even when you reach mastery in all of the martial arts, you learn that a black belt is considered your key to start learning. So this is a continuous loop. And for lack of finding a better way to visualize this, I went back to the flame graphs. And you can consider this to show what level of proficiency and what fraction of your company, perhaps, or your execution is working at a master level. In what areas? So I put our 5 areas across the bottom. And as you can see, in the case of incident prevention, we just have a little bit of novice practice going on there, or a little bit of beginner practice. Whereas on the other hand, when we look at postmortems here, we've got some practice at the master level and quite a lot that's at the competent level, for example. And just one possibility of how you might map your organization. Let me circle back to the original question. Are we really automating ourselves out of a job? Dave, I'm afraid I can't do that. We need to be careful that we're not building self-healing systems that will get to become Cyberdyne systems. But the beat does go on. Another speaker earlier today said that each 9 will cost you more than the one before it. But then again, there's never an end of the 9s that you can add. How widely are these practices adopted across your organization? Your SRE team might be the pinnacle of execution and knows how to do postmortems blamelessly in their sleep, although they don't have to because they're never woken up. But what about your dev team, for example? What about other teams that might be business analytics or something in your company? How about when everything is a service? What about customer reliability engineering, which I think there's a talk tomorrow about? So if you have thoughts about this, I welcome your input. I'd love to be able to flesh this out to a little larger degree. And if you think that some particular aspect is better characterized as being at a higher level of practice or a lower level of practice, please send me your thoughts. As soon as I can manage to get this to export from the reveal.js framework that I used, I will be making it available for giving to USENIX to post. And that's it. Thank you very much.